Welcome to Promethean Action Saturday Night Class for August 2nd with Bob Ingram. What is our nation's manifest destiny? What is our nation's mission? With special reference to President William McKinley, whom President Trump has often and appropriately cited as a predecessor. Bob just completed and published on Amazon a biography, an excellent biography of William McKinley. And I'll post a link to that in the chat later during the show. So with that, let me hand it to Bob.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here again. As Tony said, well, my title for the class, just slightly different than Tony's description, is William McKinley and America's Manifest Destiny. And I will say, I'm not going to spend, a lot of time plugging my book, but I will say that I just did publish this book, William McKinley, Principles Must Always Lead, which you can get in print version like this, in Kindle version, or an audiobook on Amazon. And I will say, with all due modesty, that this is the best biography of William McKinley ever written by anyone. So I hope you buy it.
I just put a link to it in the chat.
All right.
In Amazon.
So, yeah, we're going to discuss this question of America's manifest destiny. And, the bulk, or at least a big chunk of the presentation, is going to deal with the Spanish-American War, because this is very controversial and a lot of lies and slanders are said about it. But before we get into that, I want to just consider this term, manifest destiny, because if you go to school and you study American history, or if you follow these things at all, generally the way manifest destiny is described is that this is the traditional view, that this was the geographical expansion of the United States from the eastern seaboard out across the Mississippi River into the Great Plains, across the Rockies, and all the way to the Pacific coast. This was the manifest destiny to spread out across the continent, sort of like Horace Greeley, go west, young man, Now, I don't know who invented that term. Maybe someone does, but I think that is really not right at all. I think that is just a very, very poor understanding of the issue. Now, it gets even worse because, in recent years, particularly since the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the term manifest destiny has, become almost an epithet, or an actual epithet, synonymous with racism, genocide against the Indians, seizing land, imperialism abroad, all of the trappings that we've seen and lived through over the last, 10, 15 years or so. What I want to do tonight is to try to present, in my view, an actual understanding, a truthful understanding of what America's manifest destiny is. In some ways, this is synonymous with, the idea of a mission. What is the mission of the American Republic? But, manifest destiny expresses it in a slightly different way, a slightly different meaning, more poetic meaning. And, I think you really have to approach this by looking at what was the intention of this, of the nation, or of even before we were a nation, of the people who settled in America, going back to the Pilgrims in 1620. What was the intention of the soldiers who starved and froze at Valley Forge? What was the intention of the young men like William McKinley, who enlisted in the Union Army in 1861 to fight for human freedom. Um, you know, what was the morality? What were they fighting for? Um, what were the principles involved? And I think when you begin to consider that, that you begin to get a glimmer of what the manifest destiny of the United States really is. Now, I'm going to begin by reading to you a series of quotes, which we will put most of them up on the screen so that people can read along. Um, uh, and we're going to begin with a couple of quotes from the Pilgrims. But just sort of an introduction. I mean, again, if you want to talk about intention, um, the Pilgrims sailed in 1620. They arrived in Plymouth. They were followed 10 years later by the Puritans in Boston. But what was going on here? And, people talk about religious persecution. Well, I mean, frankly, there wasn't the Pilgrims sailed from Holland, and they were not subject to a lot of religious persecution in Holland. There were problems, but to say that narrowly this was religious persecution is just wrong. Um, the what you see when you look at this a little bit more deeply is that the intention was to escape from oligarchical rule and oligarchical culture that dominated in Europe, in every one of the European nations, to create a new type of society in the New World, a revolutionary type of society, grounded in the idea that all human beings are created in the image of God, that every human individual possesses the dual gifts of human creative reason and the divine emotion of agape. And a lot of times people leave agape out of the equation. They talk about human creativity, all of that, which clearly is extremely important. But the dual gifts we have been given from God of human creative reason and agape, and that if you look at particularly in the Pilgrims, which is to take nothing away from the Puritans, it is very clear that this was what they were determined to do. I don't want to overuse the word intention, but this was their intention, to create a new type of society, to remove themselves from the oligarchical culture of Europe, and to create a new type of society which recognized, these qualities of what it means to be a human being. So, as I said, I'm going to begin with two quotes from the Pilgrims, and then two more quotes after that. So you could put the first one up. Quote number one, Tony. I'll read it. You can read along, folks. Okay, you should be able to see that. So this was John Robinson, was the pastor of the Pilgrim Church. It wasn't called the Pilgrim Church, but without going into detail, he was the pastor of the congregation of essentially the Pilgrim Church in Holland. He never left Holland for a variety of reasons, but he was the religious leader of that church for many years. And when the Pilgrims set sail from Holland, he gave them a letter to open up once they were on their voyage had begun, to open up on the Mayflower. And this is a short excerpt from that message. And he says, "You are become a body politic, using among yourselves civil government, and are not furnished with any persons of special eminence above the rest, to be chosen by you into office of government, let your wisdom and godliness appear in choosing such persons as do entirely love and will promote the common good. Okay, well, that's a very simple quote, but, I would ask you to reflect in 1620 how revolutionary such an outlook was. You could put up the second one, Tony, number 2. This is from a sermon preached in Plymouth in the New World by Robert Cushman, who was one of the leaders of the Pilgrims. And he preached this sermon to the colonists. And the title of the sermon was The Sin and Danger of Self-Love, which was based on St. Paul's epistle, the First Corinthians, from a phrase in that epistle, let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. And this is a short excerpt. It's a long sermon, short excerpt from that sermon. I charge you, let this self-seeking be left off and turn the stream another way. Namely, seek the good of your brethren, please them, honor them, reverence them. Every man must seek the good of another. Some may think this too large a practice, since now the world is so full of people. Yet I see not but the more people there is, the larger charity ought to be. We are bound to each other, so that his wants must be my wants, his sorrows, my sorrows, his sickness, my sickness, and his welfare, my welfare. For I am as he is, and such sweet sympathy were excellent, comfortable, yea, heavenly, and it is the only maker of churches and commonwealths. So you get a little idea of the mind and the morality of the people who were involved in the Plymouth colony. So you could put up number 3. We're going to move on from the Pilgrims. This is from George Washington's farewell address in September of 1796. And again, these are just 2 short excerpts from it. But these are his sort of parting words to the American people as he is preparing to end his public career and leave office. And he says, I shall carry it with me to my grave, that heaven may continue to you the choicest tokens of its beneficence, that your union and brotherly affection may be perpetual, that the free Constitution, which is the work of your hands, may be sacredly maintained, that its administration in every department may be stamped with wisdom and virtue, that the happiness of the people of these states, under the auspices of liberty, may be complete by so careful a preservation and so prudent a use of this blessing as will acquire to them the glory of recommending it to the applause, the affection, and the adoption of every nation which is yet a stranger to it. Observe good faith and justice toward all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct. It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period a great nation to give to mankind the magnanimous example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Who can doubt that in the course of time, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages which might be lost by a steady adherence to it. Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity of a nation with its virtue? The experiment, at least, is recommended by every sentiment which ennobles human nature. Okay, that's from George Washington. And then there's going to be a few more quotes later, but for now, we'll put up one more quote. You want to put this up? And this is from John Quincy Adams, because I know there are a few people out there who hold John Quincy Adams in high esteem. And this is from his famous, and it is among certain people, it is famous, July 4th oration in 1821, which I believe he was the Secretary of State at this time. I'm not positive, but I believe he was. This is this is on the 4th of July. And again, these are just two very short excerpts from, again, a long speech. America, since her admission among the Assembly of Nations, has invariably, though often fruitlessly, held forth to them the hand of honest friendship, equal freedom, and generous reciprocity. She has uniformly spoken among them, though often to heedless and disdainful ears, the language of equal liberty, equal justice, and equal rights. She has, in the lapse of nearly half a century, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations, while asserting and maintaining her own. She has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when the conflict has been for principles to which she clings. She has seen that probably for centuries to come, all of the contests of the European world will be contests of inveterate power. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, but she is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benign sympathy of her example. So the hold on a second. So yeah, I'm just going to leave those quotes there, but hopefully you get an idea from some of this. So I said I was going to talk about the Spanish-American War and William McKinley, and there's this is discussed in depth in the book that I showed you. But I want to make a point here, which this may rankle some people, uh, but so what? Yeah, I do want to make a point because a lot has been said, and there's a lot of truth to it. So I'm not, saying this is all wrong or anything. There's a lot of truth to it, but a lot has been said about coming out of the Civil War and out of the policies of the Lincoln administration and people like Henry Carey. A lot has been said about the spread of the American system of economics, after 1865. You had the Meiji Restoration in Japan and they adopted elements of the American system. You had Bismarck in Germany, and he adopted a high protective tariff and other elements of the American system. You had the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia, and you had other countries doing similar things. And a lot has been said about this. And, and as I said, it's all true. It's all true. But there's something else that you can't sweep under the rug, that you really have to understand, which is regardless of all of this, and there were a lot of good things that came out of it, but regardless of it, the fact of the matter is that outside of the United States of America and a couple of countries that were struggling to become republics in Latin America, Mexico and some other nations in Latin America, were struggling to become independent republics. But outside of that, outside of, in particular, the American Republic, all of these other nations were empires, all of them. And to a large extent, they were oligarchical empires. They had no commitment whatsoever. I mean, there were individuals who did, like in France, of course, going back to the French Revolution, or going back to the American Revolution, you had people in France who clearly were passionately committed to the principles of the French Revolution, to the American Revolution. People like Lafayette. But the French monarchy wasn't. The French government wasn't. The French aristocracy wasn't, by and large. They were oligarchs. And the truth is, even at the time of the American Revolution, certain individuals were great friends of America, but the French monarchy and the French oligarchy, by and large, thought they could just use the rebellion in the colonies as a way to strike a blow at Great Britain, at the British Empire. Now, I don't want to go back and relive that sort of ancient history, but in the fact is, when you get into the late 19th century, the 1880s, the 1890s, the early 1900s, the administration of William McKinley, I mean, you can go to Russia, you can go to Germany, you can go to, France, you can go to Japan, you can go to all of these countries. And at the highest level of these countries, none of them, and people might really get upset at this, but I don't care. It's just the case. None of these countries, were based on the principles of the American Revolution. They did not share those principles. And in fact, when you get into the late 19th century, what you begin to see, because, we had colonialism before, going way back, Spanish colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, Dutch colonialism, then the British and the French colonialism, and you had all these colonial wars, in the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century. But when you get to the late 19th century, what do you see? You see a period lasting for decades of a great expansion of these empires. I mean, for example, this is when the great land grab begins, or really moves, gallops ahead in Africa, with the French and the British, and the Germans grabbing huge areas of Africa. This is all in the last half of the 19th century. The same thing was going on in Asia. I mean, if you look, for instance, at at China, prior to 1895, and that's pretty late, 1895. Prior to 1895, there were only two European colonies in China. There was the British in Hong Kong and the Portuguese in Macau. And these colonies went way back, long. They had been there for a long time. But that was it in 1895. But then in 1895, you had the Sino-Japanese War, which the Japanese won, and they then grabbed fairly significant chunks of China, coming out of that war. The they grabbed the island of Formosa, what we call Taiwan today. They grabbed Formosa. They grabbed I think it was however you pronounce it, the Laodong Peninsula. I'm probably mispronouncing it, and other things. And then following, these seizures by Japan, the European countries began to do the same thing. And after 1895, the Germans, the French, the British, and others, the Russians were moving in Manchuria. They began to, seize various cities, various provinces, and then you had the Boxer Rebellion, and which I'm not going to discuss, but following the Boxer Rebellion and the complete humiliating defeat of China in the Boxer Rebellion, then these countries, Japan and the rest of them, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, seized huge areas in China. As the U.S. Secretary of State John Hay said at the time, they carved up China like carving up a melon. And that's what was going on. And this is, this is simultaneous, more or less, with the McKinley presidency. And it didn't stop with China, because at the same time that this was going on in the 1890s, early, going into the 1900s, 1880s, 1890s, is these same European empires, and they're all empires. Britain's an empire, France is an empire, Germany is an empire, and even those who have a warm spot in their hearts for Russia. The Russia of Nicholas II in the late 19th century was very much an oligarchical empire. And what they began to do, particularly Germany, Japan, and Britain, is in addition to what they were, the rape of China, they began seizing islands all over the Pacific, all over the Pacific. Japan was the most aggressive, and actually, believe it or not, Germany was the second most aggressive. And they began seizing islands everywhere. Everywhere they could find one that was unclaimed by someone else, they would move in and take it over. And they were spreading these like imperial bases out into the Pacific, all the way into the Pacific. And if you look at the situation on the eve of the Spanish-American War, America is really surrounded, on all sides, not only by empires, but by empires that are expanding. And bear in mind, this is also the period of time when the British financial empire, the central banking system, the global central banking system, is expanding. And for instance, in Central America and South America, the London and French banks were subjugating nations across Latin America, to sort of become debt slaves of the city of London, and the London and Paris banks. And in fact, they sent in at one point a flotilla of British, French, and I believe Dutch gunboats to blockade Venezuela because Venezuela could not pay its debts. So you had that kind of thing going on. But you had the British Empire on our northern border, the British empires in Europe, British Empire, the European empires in Europe, the empires in Africa, the empires spreading across the Pacific. And where in the world was there a beacon for liberty, a beacon for the principles of 1776. It was only here. It was only in America. There were good people everywhere. But this was the only sovereign republic which stood forward for those principles, as in the quotes I read to you from George Washington and John Quincy Adams. You know, so that is where we found ourselves. And before I get into the Spanish-American War, I want to mention one other thing, which is, I mean, look, McKinley is routinely denounced in history books, as quote unquote the father of American imperialism, the man who made America an imperial power, and this is just vile, vile slander. But there were two things that, this is based on. The second was the Spanish-American War, when we acquired the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. And the second was the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. So I want to just briefly mention Hawaii. We can get into it more if people want to in the questions and answer period. There are people who say, well, oh, this was horrible. Hawaii was an independent country. They had a monarchy, which I guess lasted for quite a long time. I'm not an expert on Hawaiian history. And then at a certain point, the monarchy was overthrown in the I think in the 1880s. The monarchy was overthrown and they created a republic, which, some say was American-backed. It might have been, who knows? I mean, there were a lot of people involved in it. They weren't all American, agents. The Hawaiian monarchy was not like, this innocent, benign ruling government. There were a lot of Hawaiians, native Hawaiians, who did not like the Hawaiian monarchy. But nevertheless, in 1898, Hawaii was independent. And people say, oh, this was horrible. This is an example of, again, imperial manifest destiny, blah, 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 that we seized the Hawaiian Islands. But, we didn't seize them. They asked to be annexed. But but look, the reality is that in 1897, 1898, there was no way, and I don't care what kind of romantic fantasies you have, wasn't this horrible? Couldn't we have left them alone? I don't care what kind of romantic fantasies you have. There was no way in 1897 and 1898 that the Hawaiian Islands were going to remain independent. There was no way they were going to remain independent. The strategic position of Hawaii, its location, in the center of the Pacific, both as a military base and as a commercial port for trade, in the middle of the Pacific, was too important. And the Japanese were itching to take over Hawaii. Japan had actually officially, this was government policy. Japan had actually encouraged for decades Japanese emigration to Hawaii. Tens and tens of thousands of Japanese, with the blessing of the Japanese government, had emigrated to Hawaii, such that by 1897, 30% of the population of Hawaii was Japanese. There were a lot more Japanese in Hawaii than there were Americans in 1897. 30% of the population was Japanese, and Japan wanted Hawaii. And in fact, in 1897, during the sort of the midst of this crisis of what was going to happen to Hawaii, the Japan sailed a military fleet led by a battle cruiser into Pearl Harbor, and there was a military standoff between this Japanese battle cruiser and 3 American warships in Pearl Harbor, which lasted for 3 months. The empire of the rising sun wanted Hawaii, and so did Germany, and so did Great Britain. So the fact of the matter is if we had not accepted the offer from the government of Hawaii for annexation to make Hawaii part of the United States, it would have been seized by the Japanese Empire, the German Empire, or the British Empire, probably imminently. Probably imminently. And I mean, you can ask yourself the question, what would have happened in 1941 if instead of an American military base at Pearl Harbor, there had been a fortified Japanese military base at Pearl Harbor? That's a hypothetical question. But, you know, this, it's not you can't fantasize about this stuff. Um, the imperial nations were going to seize Hawaii. There's no question about it. This is not a supposition on my part. And it's only and you'll see later when we talk about the Spanish-American War that if we had not taken over the Philippines at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, it is virtually certain that Germany would have seized the Philippines. Virtually certain. It's very clear that they wanted it. So let's get into the question of the Spanish-American War. I mean, the first thing to just recognize, and I discussed this in an earlier class, is how evil the Spanish Empire really was. I mean, they were the last, European nation in the world to abolish slavery. Their colonies were run like feudalist plantations, extraordinary poverty. It was a little bit better in the Philippines than in Cuba. Cuba, it was just horrendous. Virtual slave labor for the people. And the and they and the people in Cuba revolted several times in the 19th century to try to get their independence from Spain, and those rebellions were put down savagely. And one of them lasted several years, with just enormous brutality and murder in putting these rebellions down. And then finally, in 1895, another rebellion broke out. And at that time, Spain had an occupying force, an occupying army in Cuba, just in Cuba alone, of 200,000 soldiers. They had 200,000 soldiers in Cuba. And they began putting down this 1895 rebellion, just with murderous brutality. And I mean, you might think I'm exaggerating, but in 1895, the total population of Cuba was 1.6 million. 1.6 million. And in the course of the war, which lasted about 3 years, 400,000 Cubans were killed. That's 25% of the population. The Spanish killed 25% of the population of Cuba during that 3-year period. Mostly through starvation and disease, but that was starvation that was not natural. It was imposed on the people of Cuba by Spain. Sympathies for the Spanish rebellion were overwhelming in the United States. The sympathy of the U.S. government and the sympathy of the American people was with the Spanish rebels, which is what you might expect. from the United States. And McKinley was very clear. And why don't you put up the next slide, Tony? Um, the um, uh, the number 5. Yeah, this is from McKinley's 1897 State of the Union message, and he's very clear about where the responsibility for this catastrophe lies. And this is an excerpt from his State of the Union message. The cruel policy of concentration, which is putting people essentially into concentration camps, the cruel policy of concentration was initiated February 16, 1896. The productive districts controlled by the Spanish armies were depopulated. The agricultural inhabitants were herded in and about the garrison towns, their lands laid waste, and their dwellings destroyed. This policy, the late cabinet of Spain justified as a necessary measure of war and as a means of cutting off supplies from the insurgents. It has utterly failed as a war measure. It was not civilized warfare. It was extermination. Or you could take that down. So, it would take too long to go into the details of all of this, of what McKinley did. He did not rush into war. We had no imperial designs of our own. For more than 2 years, McKinley intensively carried out negotiations with the Spanish government. He sent an extraordinary envoy there. The U.S. government issued proposals. The Spanish rejected them. The U.S. would respond with new proposals. The Spanish rejected them. And this went on and on and on. And as this situation progressed, the killing in Cuba, continued. As McKinley said, extermination. It was a war of extermination. And nothing McKinley did could get the Spanish to change policy. It just continued month after month, year after year. And I could go into details and prove to you that, the almost Herculean efforts that he made to try to force the Spanish to the negotiating table. But the Spanish turned a deaf ear to all of it. So then what happened in February of 1898 was the explosion in Havana Harbor with the destruction of the Maine, which was a U.S. battleship in the harbor of Maine. And immediately people in the United States began calling for a declaration of war against Spain. But McKinley would not do it. He resisted it. And instead, he sent new proposals to Spain, both to investigate the explosion of what had caused the explosion, and also new proposals for ending the Spanish military operations in Cuba. And he and this, again, the Spanish simply refused to negotiate. They refused to negotiate. Finally, and this went on even after the sinking of the Maine. This went on for for almost 2 months, where McKinley, not quite 2 months, but close to 2 months, where McKinley was putting forward these messages. Finally, on April 20th, McKinley gave the Spanish his final offer. He sent a message to Madrid demanding an immediate end to military operations against the Cuban people. I mean, not even against the rebel army, but against the Cuban people. The Spanish were just killing the Cuban people by the tens of thousands. And McKinley sent a message to Madrid demanding that this end immediately and that the United States be granted free access to deliver humanitarian aid, not military aid, but humanitarian aid to the people of Cuba. And the Spanish government rejected these two proposals. So when on the day that they received the message from Spain that their proposals were rejected, or that when McKinley received this, McKinley declared a blockade of Cuba and issued a call for 150,000 volunteers. And 2 days after he issued that call for volunteers and announced the blockade, the U.S. Congress passed a declaration of war against Spain, which McKinley signed. But put up the next quote, because I want to give you McKinley's thinking. This is number 6. So, number 6. So McKinley signed the declaration of war, and then he issued a statement, basically on why he signed the declaration of war, and what the war aims were, what America's aims in the war were, and this is what he said. These are excerpts. As soon as we are in possession of Cuba and have pacified the island, it will be necessary to give aid and direction to its people to form a government for themselves. This should be undertaken at the earliest moment, consistent with safety and assured success. It is important that our relations with this people shall be of the most friendly character and our commercial relations close and reciprocal. It should be our duty to assist in every proper way to build up the waste places of the island, to encourage the industry of the people, and to assist them to form a government which shall be free and independent, thus realizing the best aspirations of the Cuban people. Spanish rule must be replaced by a just, benevolent, and humane government created by the people of Cuba. So, or you could take that down. Now, the Philippines. The first thing to understand is that right on up to the declaration of war, and certainly in the years leading up, while this crisis in Cuba, while the revolt was going on in Cuba, while tens and even hundreds of thousands of people were being killed in Cuba, it was Cuba that was at the center of the crisis, of what should America do about the situation in Cuba. No one was thinking about the Philippines. And right on up to the declaration of war, McKinley and people around McKinley had no intention. They hadn't even considered the idea of America taking control of the Philippines. This was not part of the war aim. McKinley did not want it, but they were presented with a problem at the end of the war. The way McKinley put it later, or actually at the same time, really, it wasn't later, it was in 1900. He wrote a letter to a friend of his. This is not a quote. This is not something you should put up, Tony. I'll just read it. He wrote a letter to his friend of these. He says, I didn't want the Philippine Islands. And in the protocol to the peace treaty, I left myself free not to take them. But in the end, there was no alternative because, um, you know, at the end of the war, what the Spanish did at the negotiating table is they announced that they were ceding Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico was really an afterthought, and the Philippines. They were ceding these to the United States. We did not request this at the negotiating table. The Spanish ceded the Philippines to us. And McKinley said we neither expected it nor wanted it. But, you know, he was basically left with four alternatives. One, to try to return the Philippines to Spain, which morally was really not the right thing to do, and the Spanish probably wouldn't have taken them anyway. Secondly, to sell the Philippines to some other country, which was not something that McKinley was going to do. You know, third, grant immediate independence to the Philippines. And you know, you get these people who say, "Oh, that's what we should have done." It was not. It couldn't. You couldn't do it. Um, the you know, for anyone who knows anything about the history of the Philippines, you know, in the late 19th century, the Philippines were not one nation. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of islands which the Spanish had managed to take control of militarily, but they're not one people. They're not, you know, there are people with Indian backgrounds, Chinese backgrounds, Malaysian backgrounds, um, you know, racially, ethnically, in terms of religion, in terms of uh, um, uh, language. Um, it's not a country. It's not a unified country. It had never been. You know, you had, you know, from island to island, from place to place, you had local leaders, you had tribes, you had, and these people, you know, I mean, one of the things the Spanish had to do was to continually intervene to keep these various ethnic and tribal groups from fighting each other. You know, it was very chaotic. And with the Spanish leaving, the Philippines would have been plunged into anarchy. And what almost certainly would have happened is that another European country would have intervened and taken them over. Again, one of the empires. And it was known that the Germans very much wanted the Philippines. And in fact, when after the Battle of Manila Bay with Dewey, when we landed troops near Manila, American troops during the war, when we landed troops in Manila, the both the German Navy and the German Army, which were present there at the time, intervened militarily, and they tried to stop the landing of American troops, on Philippine soil. Not the Spanish, the German Army and Navy tried to prevent the landing of American troops. Not because the German were in an alliance with the Spanish, they weren't, but because Germany wanted the Philippines. And if we had said, okay, in 1899, you're free, the Philippines, it would have lasted months at most before Germany, or even possibly Japan, but more likely Germany, would have moved in and taken them over. It's also the case that the Philippines had a much lower literacy level, and it was much more backward society at that time, particularly once you got away from Manila, than Cuba was. So you know the so the so the decision was made. What happened was McKinley sent a message to Congress in 1899, where he rejected completely annexing Cuba, instead saying we must see to it that a free Cuba is a reality, not a name, but a perfect entity. And he said in the same message that it will be the policy of the United States that we will place the Philippines under American protection, but it will be the policy of the United States to build up the Philippines, to aid them economically, to build up industry, to build schools, to build hospitals, to develop the Philippines economically and through education, to the point where they are able to become actual independent nations. And that's exactly what we did. With Cuba, Cuba was independent by 1902. It took about a year and a half, but they were independent by 1902. In terms of the Philippines, one of the first things that we did when we took control of the Philippines was we destroyed all the opium crops, which is something that a lot of people don't know about. But the Spanish had created quite large opium plantations on a number of the islands, and had become sort of a junior player in the British opium trade. And one of the first things the U.S. Army did when they took control was we located these plantations and we wiped out all the opium crops, and we aided the farmers in growing agricultural products, growing food. But otherwise, the I believe it was by 1902 or something, the Philippines were essentially not given autonomy, but they were given what amounts to as self-government. They were granted virtually all political and constitutional rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, except the right to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. All of this was granted. I think by 1902 or 1903, I forget the exact year, the U.S. Congress passed the Philippine Organic Act, which granted the Philippines the right to elect a national assembly, and they became essentially semi-autonomous, where all of the laws governing the Philippine people were passed by the Philippine Assembly. And then in 1916, the Philippine Autonomy Act was passed by Congress, granting the Philippines full autonomy. So by 1916, the Philippines are completely autonomous. And it was shortly after that that the timetable was set up for full independence, which was slated to come in 1944, but it was delayed because of World War II till 1946. So you could say we controlled the Philippines till 1946. I think if McKinley had not been assassinated in 1901, that this process in the Philippines might have gone somewhat faster. But the fact is, we kept our promise to the people of Cuba of full independence, and we ultimately kept our promise to the people of the Philippines. And neither of them became colonies of an oligarchical empire. And so let's put up these last few quotes, Tony, because I'm going a little long here, and I still want to get to our little surprise at the end. So put up quote number 7. This is from McKinley's first inaugural. These are quotes from McKinley, 3 of them. This is from his first inaugural. It has been the policy of the United States, and I would ask you to reflect back while I'm reading these on the quotations I read from George Washington, John Quincy Adams, and frankly, even the quotations I read from the Pilgrim Fathers. So this is from the first inaugural. It has been the policy of the United States since the foundation of the government to cultivate relations of peace and amity with all the nations of the world. And this accords with my conception of our duty now. We have cherished the policy of non-interference with affairs of foreign governments, wisely inaugurated by Washington, keeping ourselves free from entanglement, either as allies or foes, content to leave undisturbed with them the settlement of their own domestic concerns. It will be our aim to pursue a firm and dignified foreign policy which shall be just, impartial, and honorable. Our diplomacy should seek nothing more and accept nothing less than is due us. We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. War should never be entered upon until every agency of peace has failed. Peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency. So that's from McKinley's first inaugural address. Put up the next one, number 8. This is a speech that McKinley gave to something called the Ohio Society of New York. This is in 1900. This is during, or right about the time, maybe at the conclusion, I don't know. It's right about the time of the Spanish-American War. And McKinley says, there can be no imperialism. Those who have faith in the Republic are against it, so that there is universal abhorrence for it and unanimous opposition to it. Those who do not agree with us have no confidence in the virtue or capacity or high purpose or good faith of this free people as a civilizing agency, while we believe that the century of free government which the American people have enjoyed has not rendered them irresolute and faithless, but has fitted them for the great task of lifting up and assisting to better conditions and larger liberty those distant people who through the issue of battle have become our wards. Let us fear not. The liberators will never become the oppressors. A self-governed people will never permit despotism in any government which they foster and defend. So that's his attitude towards the Philippines and Cuba. So put up the final quote from McKinley. All right. And I think I've read this at least once before, maybe twice in previous classes, but I'm going to read it again. This is a couple of excerpts, and this is where I got the title to my book, from McKinley, again, as in the case of John Quincy Adams. This is a 4th of July oration, one which McKinley delivered in Connecticut in 1891 on the 4th of July. 2 short excerpts. It is a common thing to say, but a good thing to say because it is true, that we have the best government in the world. It represents the best thought and the best civilization. Even more, it represents the hope and future of mankind. And yet, it has never been as good as its principles. It was not so from the beginning, and it is not now. Our principles are always better than our practices. This is true of individuals. as well as nations. Principles must always lead. They are the advanced guard of right thought and action. The Declaration of Independence, which sounded the voice of liberty to all mankind, was in advance of the thought of the great body of the people. It took 100 years of national life and national thought and earnest agitation, and at last wasting war to place this government where the Declaration of Independence anchored it. So you could take that down. So, there's something else I'm going to just do, sort of a little funny add on. But to just conclude this train of thought on McKinley, on the manifest destiny of America, on, what the Spanish-American War was really all about. I mean, it was an anti-imperial war. Anti-imperial war. I just want to conclude this by saying, look, there is a lot that is being fought out right now. And in particular, if you look at some of these things occurring, the tariff policy, the fight that's broken out around the Federal Reserve, economic policy, and all of this. I mean, all of this is of extreme importance. Extreme importance. But, I want to just, say, it is my view, my personal view, my belief that in the fight to rescue our nation, that ultimate victory will not be ours until we reawaken in the American people a devotion to the principles, to the founding principles of our republic. If you think of McKinley and what he's talking about in terms of the war aims of America in the Spanish-American War, the war aims, the anti-imperial war aims. If you think of Washington in the farewell address, if you think of what Quincy Adams is talking about, these are not practical policies. They are grounded in an idea of America, the manifest destiny of America. To serve as the temple of hope and the beacon of liberty for all of mankind. That is our manifest destiny, the temple of hope and the beacon of liberty. To go back, to the Pilgrims, in fact, and to others, that, we are not beasts, we are not slaves, that we are something far nobler, and that our republic is based on principles that are noble and that are unique to the world. And we are gonna proclaim this to all of humanity and serve as the shining example. We're going to shine light. We're going to be a light in the darkness against the oligarchy. Against the oligarchy of today, as much as the oligarchy of former times. There was a time when, and I don't know how far back you have to go, but it was very common for a long period of time, decades after decades after decades. I don't really know when it died out, but there was a time when, you would have 4th of July celebrations all across America. Picnics, parades, rallies, barbecues, whatever. You'd have 4th of July celebrations. And there was a time when at all of these 4th of July celebrations, or at least at most of these 4th of July celebrations, a time would come in the celebration when someone who had been chosen to do it would stand up and the people would be quiet and the chosen speaker would read the entirety of the Declaration of Independence to the people who were assembled there. This was common across America, not just here and there. It was expected that this would be done at July 4th celebrations. And I'll tell you something, even it never became quite as widespread, but it was fairly common, at least, that in 1878, George Washington's birthday was made a national holiday. You know, not President's Day. His actual birthday was made a national holiday to honor Washington. And for many years, at many of these celebrations, a similar sort of thing would happen. Whereas people got together to honor Washington or to celebrate Washington, someone would stand up and someone would read Washington's farewell address to the people who were in attendance. That we kept this mission of America, the ideas of America, alive from generation to generation to generation. Now, I have heard that sometime soon, maybe next year, maybe the year after next, we are, I guess, expecting to send astronauts back to the moon. I don't know the details of it. People probably hear, some people here probably know it. To send astronauts to the moon. And you know what I think would be a great thing? Is if they got up to the moon and they all got together. I mean, I guess they'd have to do it inside the capsule, you know. They all got together and into the camera that everyone could view on Earth, one of them were to read the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. I mean, I think that would be an appropriate message from the moon to the people of Earth, not just to the American people, to the people of Earth. So that, I think, is America's manifest destiny. So there is one other thing I want to put up. I don't want to detract from what I just said, but hey, who knows? This may provoke more discussion than the class. So this will take 5 minutes, folks. Then we'll open it up. You want to run through these 3 slides real quick, Tony?
Doesn't have to be real quick.
Well, I'm not going to say much about them. I'm just going to put them up. Demographics, folks. As I think all of you know, you say, what the hell has this got to do with manifest destiny? Well, you know, in a way it does. Demographics. The demographic crisis. You can see this is the birth rate in various nations.
Total fertility.
Total fertility.
Children per life.
Children per woman.
Children per woman.
Children per, per woman. Births per woman. In 2024, so that's only last year. And you could see things look pretty dire in South Korea and Taiwan.
To sustain an equal population today, you need 2.1.
Yeah. I don't want to explain this a lot, Tony. I'm going to run through this real quick. But you could see it's not good, you know. And China is almost as bad as, you know, Taiwan and South Korea. But then you run it down, it's all real bad. Italy, Spain, Canada, Germany, the UK. And then there's the United States there at 1.6. Russia's 1.8. Russia, surprisingly, has increased their fertility rate in recent years, which is somewhat unique in the world. Maybe not totally unique, but there's not too many countries doing that. But the United States is at 1.6, so ours is beginning to approach. For a long time, we were not in the range of like, Italy or Spain or something, or Japan, but it's been going down. And below that, you see the U.S. Um, fertility rate. And you can see this is over a period of years. 1950, 3 births per woman. 1960, it actually went up, 3.5 births per woman. 2.5 in 1970, still above 2, 1990, 2000. And then when it really begins to collapse, I don't know the year it went below 2, but it really begins to collapse in 2008, when you had 2 things happen in 2008. First of all, you had, the financial crisis, the financial meltdown of 2008, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, all that. But you also had the election of Barack Obama. And we had 8 years of Barack Obama from 2008 to 2016. So then you see in 2010, it drops to 1.93, 2020, 1.64, and here we are in 2024 and 1.60. So this is not good, right? Put up the next slide. But this is interesting. These are the states with the highest and lowest fertility rates in the United States, and you can see the top ones at the top 10 are the ones with the highest fertility rates. South Dakota 2.1, and I'm not going to read them all off. You can see there, and it goes down. Number 10 is Utah at 1.80, and then you look at the states with the lowest fertility rates. Number 41, this is out of 50. 41 is Illinois, and then it goes down, Washington, California. And then it ends at, Bernie Sanders' paradise, Vermont, 1.30. And at 1.30, you are getting in the range of, Japan. You're getting in the range of, Italy and Spain. You're getting to a European level birth rate. So now one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the top 10 states, 1 through 10, with the highest fertility rates, those are all states that voted for Donald Trump in the 2024 election. And if you look at the bottom 10 states, those are all states that voted for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election. Now, is that a coincidence? I don't think so. And put up the final slide, Tony. This is a map of those same states, right? You can see total fertility rates, children per woman. And the red states are where you have the higher fertility rates, and the low states are where you have the lower fertility rates are the blue ones. Now, does this look, familiar to someone? Doesn't it look a little bit like the Electoral College map of the 2024 election? I just find it very interesting, because ask yourself this, leave that up, Tony. Ask yourself this, look at those red states. All right, we always say that the birth rate, and again, I'm not taking away from the fact that we need single income households, to raise families like the 1950s and 60s, that we need higher wages, that we need higher living standards, that if we do this, it'll make family formation, more possible. I'm not arguing that. That's obviously true. But on the other hand, ask yourself this. Are people in Louisiana or Arkansas, do they have a substantially higher standard of living than people in Rhode Island or Massachusetts? Or New Jersey, actually New Jersey's a little bit higher, or Vermont, or, one of these states, the people living in, I don't know, you know, does this break down that the people who, have, where we have the highest standard of living, where we have the highest wages, are the states that have the highest fertility rate? And clearly, it doesn't break down that way. I mean, the way I view it, and people can argue this, and I don't want to take anything away from the class, but I think it has something to do with it, which is why I'm bringing it up. That where we see the higher fertility rates is in the states that voted for Trump. Now, what characterizes, it's not just that they're Republicans, because, a lot of independents, a lot of Democrats voted for Trump. But what do you see in the people who support Trump? You see people who are optimistic about the future, who know that although the economy may not be great now in a lot of ways for a lot of people, that they have confidence that Trump is going to make things better and is beginning to make things better. Among other things, I mean, you can even look at some of the cultural things, his fight against the drug trafficking, the transgenderism and all this nonsense, but also his opening up of new industries, nuclear power, and all of these things. It's not just that this thing is that these are having enormous effects on people yet, but what you have is a certain percentage of our population who, are optimistic about the future. That they see what Trump is. They see the potential for this country, what America once was, what America can once yet become again. They see the potential for this to begin to emerging. Now, people can argue with me about that. I don't want to get into a big thing of demographics, but I thought I'd bring it up because I do find it interesting. Because you could take that down, Tony. Because, as I said, just I would ask people, reflect on this question. What is our deeper manifest destiny? What sets America apart? What gives us optimism about the future? Because you can even go back to the quotes I read to you from the Pilgrims. An optimism about what it means to be a human being. An optimism about creating a type of society which is coherent with the gifts we have been given from God. And that is the beacon of light that we can share with the rest of the world. So, anyway, I talked a long time. Let's stop there.